So I just want to stay at the start of this particular section that we will be going into, that it is one of those sections that could be taught in a variety of different ways. When we get into the parable of the sower, as it is sometimes called, or it is sometimes called the parable of the seed, or it is sometimes called the parable of the different soils. Any one of those, of course, is a legitimate title for what Jesus decides to teach and to proclaim to those who would hear him. I am going to do this in two sections, and I'm going to do it a little bit different, maybe, than some might choose to do. But as I was looking through and thinking about the various ways that this could be taught and the various ways that you could teach someone else, I thought that I would do exactly with this what Christ did in regard to he laid out the parable and then he gives or offers no explanation to the crowd. He just asks them to hear what he has to say. And so I'm going to read from Mark, the first chapter, and we're not going to be doing 1 through 20. We are going to be in this first section looking at the first 9 verses. Starting in Mark chapter 4, beginning at verse 1, it says, "And again he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude was gathered to him, so that he got into a boat, and sat in it on the sea, and the whole multitude was on the land facing the sea. Then he taught them many things by parables, and said to them in his teaching, Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And it happened, as he sowed, that some of the seed fell by the wayside, and the birds of the air came and devoured it. Some fell on stony ground, where it did not have much earth, and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away." Verse 7, "And some seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. But other seed fell on the good ground, and yielded a crop that sprang up, increased, and produced some 30-fold, some 60, and some 100. And he said to them, He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Excuse me. So beginning at verse 1, we see that he again is going to teach by the sea, and once again a great crowd has gathered, so he is going to go ahead and find himself in a boat out in the sea. And the reasoning for this is that it allows for the crowd to have a better view of him as he is teaching. There's not just this big mass or mob of people swarming all around him, but what you have is the people on the shore facing out in the same direction toward the sea. And so being out there allowed for a more controlled environment and an easier showing for the crowd to listen and to watch and to listen as Christ spoke unto them. In verse 2, he taught them many things by parables and said to them in his teaching. And parables, there are multiple definitions that people give with or for parables, one of which is simply an earthly story with a spiritual truth. Parables come from the idea of to set alongside. So Jesus uses parables to set a spiritual truth alongside a physical truth that would commonly be understood. And so as we're studying how Jesus Christ teaches other people, and as we consider how we should teach others, and the message to us is that it is good for us to be able to take things that people that we are studying with would understand and use those physical things to help them to grasp or understand those things of a spiritual nature. And then he makes the statement, listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. And so the first thing that he tells the crowd is, listen. He is now in the process of wanting to speak. And generally, when you want people to listen, or when you're about to speak, you want people to quiet down. You want them to listen. You want them to pay attention to what you're about to say. So, Jesus is basically saying, it's time to pay attention. Crowd, stop what you're doing and listen. And so he begins his teaching. And what he's going to do is use a very simple message that they would understand in order to begin his teaching. So he's going to explain to them something that is very easily understood, and it's not something that they're unfamiliar with. And we need to, again, think about this, and we need to be very careful that when we are studying with other people, oftentimes they are not familiar with the scriptures. They are not familiar with some of the things that we already know or understand. And we need to be careful, and we need to make sure that we don't just take it for granted that they may know something that they don't actually know. Or we may take it for granted that they should understand something because it's something that we've grown up around or something that we're very familiar with. We need to make sure that as we teach, just as Jesus does, that we are helping them to understand by using things that are familiar concepts and ideas to them. Verse 4, as he goes in, he says, and it happened as he sowed that some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds of the air came and devoured it. Now, the wayside is a road near the edge of a field, or it could be a path that runs the full length of the field or through the field. But either way, we understand that the ground is very hard due to constant foot traffic. So what we have is we have this seed that falls on this hard ground, and because the ground is hard, the seed is not able to penetrate, so it just sits on the surface, and we see that the birds of the air come and they devour it. So we understand that if the birds get to the seed and they eat the seed, then there's not going to be any growth from that seed. And we don't need to explain any further than that. In verses 5 and 6, Jesus goes on to say that some of the seed fell on the stony ground, where it did not have much earth, and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. And so, again, the people here are going to understand the idea of sowing seed and trying to grow crop. And the stony places are something that are common in Palestine, and it would be something that they would be familiar with seeing. And so oftentimes there would be an outcropping of limestone rock that was covered by a thin layer of topsoil. And because there's this thin layer, the soil appears that it is ready to be sown, but in actuality, there is no real depth to it. It's kind of a false image, if you will, or it's kind of tricking a person into looking at it and thinking it's prepared to go ahead and be used. But it's not ready to be sown, and so what happens is, because there's no depth, there's no strong root that takes place within the ground. So when the sun does beat down, the plant withers and dies, and there is no fruit. Or we would say there is no profit that comes from the sowing of the seed. And again, we don't need to go any further than that. And then in verse 7 it says, some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. The thorny ground, and I found this illustration or explanation, and I thought this was good. The third response is illustrated by the seed which fell on the thorny ground. The thorns would not be immediately apparent, but their root system was there underneath the ground. Much like the previous, again, this ground gives the appearance of being fruitful, for the plant begins to make progress. So we start to see some actual growth. But all the time, something is happening under the surface. The root system of the thorns is slowly drawing all the goodness out of the soil, and at the same time strangling the seed which has been sown and prevents it from becoming established. So once again, while it looks like there's going to be some form of yield, and it actually goes a little bit further maybe than it did on the stony ground, ultimately there is no crop yielded. Ultimately it is strangled or choked out. And then finally in chapter 4 and verse 8, we see that other seed fell on the good ground, and it yielded a crop that sprang up and increased and produced, and some of it 30-fold, and some 60, and some 100. And so we see that there is production, and actually there is production at different levels, but there is production that takes place in this good soil. It is ground that is prepared. It has been worked and tilled, and it is prepared for the sowing of the seed. And the seed germinates within the soil, the plant begins to grow, and when it reaches full maturity, it bears fruit for the sower. It is the ultimate result of what it is that the sower is looking for. The sower goes out and he spreads the seed, not just because it seems like something to do, but because he has an ultimate goal in mind. And that ultimate goal, of course, is to have a field that bears fruit, that brings about something that is of value to the sower. And so I want to make a quick point here about the seed and the soil, and something that you could stop and you could take note of with a person that you may be studying with. And that is that the seed all comes from the same place. And so that's very important. The seed that's sown isn't different in different areas. It's all the same seed. It's all from the same source. He's not using different types of seeds on different types of soil. He's using the same seed. It is the soil or the ground which receives the seed that is different. And so that's going to be something that we're going to want to make note of and make sure that we understand that that which is being sown is not different in different areas. It's the same in all. And really, the emphasis of the story as I see it, and this is a personal opinion and one that I would not bind on anyone, but I see here that the emphasis of the story really should be on the soil that receives the seed, because that's where we find the differences. That's where we find things don't happen the same, but it's the same sower sending out the seed, and it's coming from the same source as far as it's all the same seed and the same type of seed. So that's really where he ends it. And it's interesting, you'll find now in verse 9, so he's given this parable, and then in verse 9 he says to the crowd again, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And I like how one writer or commentator put it. He said, this statement serves as a nice bookend to the statement made back in verse 3, where he tells the people to listen. So in verse 3, he gets their attention and he says, listen, and then he finishes with his parable, and he says to them, now he who has ears, let him hear what has been said. And he points out, this commentator points out, that listening involves an effort to catch the words that are spoken. Pay attention, catch them. The words are out there. Catch those words and bring them in. And then to hear now what has been said, to hear what you were listening to, is to analyze and to truly understand what was just said. And so Jesus at this point is now saying to the audience, analyze and understand what I have just said. And it's interesting at this point, and we'll make note of it here, and you can make note with the person that you might be studying with, if you happen to be studying with someone, that there is no explanation from Jesus to the crowd as far as how they were to interpret this particular parable. He puts it out there, and he puts it out there for them to listen to, for them to hear, and for them to analyze. And that's where he leaves it. And so that is where we will leave it, just as he did for this particular short session. And we will pick up in verse 10 of chapter 4 in the next segment. So again, I appreciate your time. I encourage you between now and next week, if you would like, to certainly take advantage of the opportunity to go through and to read from chapter 4 and the first 20 verses. Thank you.